Well, good afternoon and welcome to this seminar being jointly sponsored by the Electoral Regulation Research Network and the Australasian Study of Parliament Group. My name is Michael Maley and I'm one of the ERRN coordinators from the ACT. And I'd like to start by acknowledging and showing my respect to the traditional custodians of this land and their elders past and present. And I would like also to acknowledge other Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples who may be present. We are here today to celebrate, I think that is an appropriate word, the centenary of the Commonwealth Electoral Act, which actually clocks up this Wednesday the anniversary of the receipt of Royal Assent to the Commonwealth Electoral Bill 1918. This is an act which has massively influenced the nature of Australian politics at both the federal and state levels, and has even extended its influence beyond our shores, which we can see most recently with the adoption of preferential voting for the congressional districts in the state of Maine, in one of which the distribution of preferences actually changed the result which would have occurred on primary votes. In the tradition of birthday parties, we have a number of people here today who can speak with experience of the life and times of the subject we are celebrating. And I will just introduce them very briefly and then hand over to each of them to speak for approximately 15 minutes, after which we will have a period for questions and contributions from the floor. Our first speaker is Dr. Peter Brent, at the end of the table, well known for his study of the history of electoral administration in Australia, and also for his Mumble-Twits Twitter account, which prolifically comments on modern Australian politics. Dr. Stephen Mills will speak second. Has also had a long history both with electoral processes and with this Parliament, having worked in both the old and new Parliament houses. He is the author of the much acclaimed book, The Professionals, which looks at the professionalisation of political party election campaigning in Australia. Our third speaker will be Mr. Brian Hallett, who probably needs very little introduction to anyone in this audience, who at different times has been head of the communications branch at the Australian Electoral Commission, Deputy Official Secretary to the Governor-General, and most recently, Usher of the Black Rod. Our final speaker will be Dr. Diane Herriot, who also needs very little introduction in this room, as she is the Parliamentary Librarian. Without further ado, I will hand the floor over to Peter Brent.
Thanks, Michael. And is this working? Cool. And thanks everyone for coming. This is what we're gathered here for. This is the Commonwealth Electoral Act 100 years ago. It was 62 pages then. It's now 572 pages. I suppose every bit of legislation is a camel in the sense that a camel is a horse designed by a committee, but I don't know how you describe that then has been added onto that, and this taken off, and more renovations and renovations on renovations, and it's almost 10 times its original size. Actually, 572 is not, that was before last week, so it would be larger. That's just the list of contents back then. Now, everyone has their own favourite thing about the Commonwealth Electoral Act 1918. Stephen loves campaigns. Some people love preferential voting. There's finance, which is a favourite of many people, and redistributions. But mine is the development of the EMB, the Electoral Management Body, the Election Management Body, which every country that runs elections has at least one. We have 9, one for each state and territory, and one for national elections. And we have a few, there's a former ACT Electoral Commissioner here, and we have some AC people here, and it's great that they are here. And this is about, I'm just briefly going to give background to about the legislative path to the 1918 Act and how the development of our way of running elections was all wrapped up in that story and how that came into being. In 1904, the then Chief Electoral Officer gave this diagram to a select committee showing the structure of the then Australian Electoral Office, which was part of the Home Affairs Ministry. And in some ways it's changed today, but in many ways it's the same. You get rid of the minister and the department head, and you have the electoral commissioner here, and then there's a head for each state, and below the head for each state there are DROs, divisional returning officers, and that was then, and it still is now, but it was particularly then a unique Australian feature, the permanent returning officer. In most countries today as well, but there are a few have joined us since then, but definitely back then, returning officers just came into life at election time, but here they are there all the time, permanently running enrolment and just running things in their electorate. But our story begins in 1832, back in the mother country with the Reform Act. And the Reform Act was, it's known in England for its expanding the franchise to middle class chaps. There were several Reform Acts in England. This one's known for expanding the franchise to middle class chaps. But for our purposes, or what's really interesting about it, is it laid down the way of running elections for the first time. It talked about enrolment. Before then there were no electoral rolls. Before then, elections were fairly laissez-faire affairs. Chappie would turn up and say, I'm voting for so-and-so, and other chappies would go, okay, we're marking you down. And there might be arguments about whether they were able to vote, and these arguments might stretch on for months after the election, which would delay the election result. So they decided we'll have an electoral list, and arguments about whether someone's able to vote can be sorted out well in advance. So that's what they did, and they would be listed annually, and they said who would make the list. They were generally town clerks, people like that, people in local council. And at election time, you'd have returning officers, can't really see that, coming into being. And I don't know whether you can see that these are, it described who would be returning officer, and these were important people, mayors, high bailiffs, master cutler. So these are important people, because returning officer is the person who conducts the election, fills out the writ, who has won the election and returns it to the Speaker of the House. And so these are chaps you've got to be able to trust. Whereas conducting the rolls, you could leave that to less important people, because there were courts afterwards and there were processes of objecting, but people look at lists and say, I don't think that person has a right to vote, and that would go to a court and so on. So that's what Australia, or New South Wales, inherited when it ran its first colony-wide election in 1843. So that's what's important. It was, had elections started here 20 years earlier, we would have inherited something else, but we started when we did, so that's what we inherited. And there were no local councils in Australia. Well, sorry, there were limited local councils in New South Wales at the time. There was Sydney and Melbourne, and maybe one or two others, but there were police districts pretty well everywhere where there was settlement, and so the police ran the elections instead of local councils, or rather the police collected the rolls, and they would do it on their own police district. And at election time, they'd hand the rolls to returning officers. And that's the Act of UK Parliament. Then we move along to 1851, which is in South Australia, and that's more important because South Australia is where the action really took place. And in 1851, there was now a Victoria, and there was Tasmania had come into being in the 1830s, and South Australia. So these three colonies, not Western Australia, they joined New South Wales in having legislative council elections for 2/3 of their legislative councillors on property franchise, property income franchise. 1/3 was appointed. And so South Australia had to work out how to run elections and how to collect electoral rolls, and they didn't even have police districts all over South Australia. So they mucked around for a few years, and it was a bit of a disaster. So they decided that they would give roll collection to the returning officers, because returning officers, as we know, are trustworthy chaps. And this meant that returning officers would become permanent, albeit part-time, but they would be returning officer not just for an election, but every year, all year. And this facilitated continuous enrolment, transfers between electorates, a lot of the things that we are familiar with today. They also had the South Australia, the province, the whole colony of South Australia would be one electorate for the Legislative Council. And you need a returning officer for that. And so they appointed a guy called William Robinson Boothby to be the returning officer for South Australia, and he became the chief, really the de facto chief electoral officer. And he, not as much as he wanted to be, but he was in charge of the DROs. They were called district returning officers. They're divisional returning officers now, I think. They were district returning officers then. And they answered to him. He was they were his deputies for the lower house seats. He ran the elections for the upper house seats. And these are all permanent positions. And this is really where the particularly Australian model, where it branched into that particular direction, and we still have it today. We still have permanent returning officers today. And in 1856, there's the male franchise, when all these colonies got responsible government, which was elections in 2 houses of parliament and executive formed in the lower house, and from then on they'd have actually prime ministers, they often called them. They were premiers or prime ministers, and they had full male suffrage, and the Australian ballot, which was a totally new way of running elections. And that involved, these colonies in 1856 wanted to have the secret ballot, and they looked around the world to those places that had the secret ballot, for example France and some American states, and they didn't like what they saw. It didn't work very well, so they made up their own version, which involved the returning officer either writing or printing the candidates on a ballot paper, and we all know how that works now, but that was invented back then. And that again gave the returning officers more work and put more duties onto them. But we can see the structure beginning to grow, that organisational structure, that hierarchy. And for the rest of the century in South Australia, they just kept struggling to run elections, making things up as they go along, changing things, but it developed in this particular hierarchical structure. And that was giving the returning officers the... Now this guy on the left, William Robinson Boothby, he was the boss, and these are a few of the returning officers on the right. And there was a fair bit of friction between them. He sort of thought they didn't pay enough attention to his wise words. They thought that he sort of stuck his nose in too much. They complained that they weren't paid enough. He used to boast that South Australia had the cheapest elections of all the Australian colonies. So in the late 80s, he tried to get rid of them. He wanted to go to... By now, the other colonies did have colony-wide local council structures, and he wanted to do that, to do what they did back home, back in England, as they still referred to it, and that was still a descriptor that impressed people. Well, they do like that back at home, you know, maybe we should do that. And he wanted to get rid of the returning officers, have clerks, local councils collect rolls, and just have returning officers at election time. as the other places did it, but he failed. And had he not failed, history would be different, but he did fail. And in 1902, that's what the country looked like when the colonies came together for federation. They had a conference was organised of electoral officials from each now state, and Boothby's there, number 4 from South Australia. George Lewis is number 1 from New South Wales. He would become the first Chief Electoral Officer for the Commonwealth of Australia, and they decided, as you can see in the yellow at the bottom, to construct something like the South Australian bureaucracy. So they decided to do that and go with permanent returning officers and so on and so forth, and continuous enrolment and so on. And so it was in 1903, the first Chief Electoral Officer, George Lewis, was giving a pep talk to a bunch of New South Wales DROs in preparation for the first election, and he began by describing how elections were run everywhere but South Australia, and also back in England at the time. That is, the returning officer is galvanised into life about 4 or 5 weeks prior to the election to prepare for warfare. Then all the energy of the electoral officer is centred into about 6 or 8 weeks of time. Then he lapses into a state of quiescence during the winter of his electoral age until the drum sounds once more. But now, under these new South Australian arrangements, you, the DROs, are the very centre of life and authority from which all the active motive administrative power emanates. And upon the returning officer of the division will rest the responsibilities as well as the privileges of administering the entire Act. From the time you accept the responsibilities and privileges of the position, you are the direct and controlling power. You become the electoral king. And this is not a pun, but this picture is of King O'Malley, who in 1903 experienced just how bolshy these kings could be. He was the Minister for Home Affairs, the Labor Minister for Home Affairs, and he tried to interfere in the running of the election in his seat in Tasmania, and he tried to dictate who could be allowed to work there. He said he gave a list of people. He said, these people are unacceptable, they can't work here. Here's a list of much more suitable people who could work at the election. And the Chief Electoral Officer was initially rather compliant because I suppose he was his boss after all. But there was pushback from further down, from the divisional level, and in the end the DRO wrote back to the Chief Electoral Officer saying, kindly inform the Minister it's useless trying to dictate who we will employ, we decide who we employ, and so on. So that's an early indicator of the independence, the robustness of the AEC. The organisational structure is not the only reason for that. There's a lot of received culture and so on, but it's part of it. And of course the kings these days, especially with electoral rolls now largely done without bits of paper, you have to wonder what they do all year, every year. I think for quite a few decades, electoral commissioners have dreamed and sometimes partly succeeded in amalgamating them, getting rid of them, but they remain pretty strong. They tend to have the local MPs on their side. So that's been an ongoing issue for a few decades. I think there are now 130-something divisional officers to cover 151 electorates. So that is the background to 1918. It all culminates in 1918 in this glorious document we have here. Just briefly describe, I was going to make a diagram of this, but it was very difficult. The way the legislature travelled to Australia was that each colony, when it started running elections, it didn't really look to the other colonies, it looked to England, because England was the font of everything that was sensible and rational and English. And so, for example, WA, when it first started running elections, didn't have the Australian ballot because England didn't have the Australian ballot. WA started in the 1870s having elections. And it was only after England had got the ballot that they said, oh yes, well, you know, it's the English way after all. So if you were to draw a diagram of the path here, you'd go Reform Act, New South Wales, then Reform Act, South Australia, up to Federation, then they all sort of join there, and then there's a new central path that goes up. From 1902, they were no longer really looking to England. For example, on this, they felt that they had enough experience in all these 6 countries to work out how to run an election. So, yes, that's it. Thank you. Thanks very much.
Stephen.
Thanks, Mike. Thanks, Peter. Well, 100 years ago, as the guns fell silent in Europe, the fierce combat continued here in the Australian Parliament. Monash's AIF may have helped complete the fight for democracy, but the Billy Hughes-led nationalist government and the Frank Tudor-led Labor opposition made sure that the fighting of democracy, fighting about democracy, continued, specifically on this parliamentary battlefield called electoral reform. And it's perhaps somewhat improbable, but that's the fact. They did create the durable framework for Australian elections, the Commonwealth Electoral Act 1918, whose centenary we're celebrating now. That's using Mike's word, celebrating. Well, section 39(4) of the Act sets out the eligibility requirements for enrolment. It rules out those of unsound mind, those attainted by treason, those imprisoned for sentences of 12 months or more. And then finally it rules out the original continuing inhabitants of this land. And it does so in language by bundling Indigenous Australians together with a hemispheric sweep of other non-white people. It declares that, quote, no Aboriginal native of Australia, Asia, Africa, and the islands of the Pacific, except New Zealand, unquote, shall be entitled to enrol or vote. So certainly 100 years ago, it was definitely okay to be white here in Australia. And in fact, this document is explicitly, it's unapologetically racist. That wasn't part of any second reading debate at issue. It's as egregious a policy document as the White Australia policy ever produced. So against that background, I just think that needs acknowledging. My role is to talk about how the parties campaigned, how the Act influenced how they campaigned. And I'll just talk briefly about 4 aspects of the debate, of the Act. First of all, its uniform national scope. Secondly, its relatively light regulatory touch. Thirdly, its highly partisan character. And fourth, its failure to control campaign finance. So just briefly, each of those in turn. So this Act is truly uniform and national. It was an act of consolidation. It repealed all of the hodgepodge that had grown up since 1902 and reenacted most of it in a single piece of legislation, adding in a few new things, including most notably preferential voting. So the aim was uniformity, and the effect really was nationalisation. Australia, according to the minister, the author of the Act, Paddy Glynn, very interesting forgotten figure, Minister for Home and Territories in the nationalist government, he pointed out, he argued that Australia had established, quote, the principle that the expense as well as the provision of electoral machinery is a legitimate obligation of the state. And the Act gave effect to that in various ways, notably through the electoral machinery that Peter's just described, where we see the safeguarding of the electoral system from any form of state and local meddling, such as we see, for example, in the United States right now. So the contrast is stark. This national scope also had the effect, I think, of a profound delayed effect of, on the political parties and on how they campaigned. There were some knock-on financial benefits, especially when compulsory voting came in 1924. It saved the parties a lot of money. But more generally, I think the Act did help orient the political parties, which were then very state-based, to the national stage. And I think that was quite an important development. Remember, 3 years earlier, the Labor Party established the first national machinery of any political party. It set up the federal executive and appointed its first national secretary, Arch Stewart. These were firsts for Labor, first for Australian politics, significant stages, developments, I argue, in the centralisation and professionalisation of election campaigns. But the reality is that that federal apparatus was basically, it remained a very poor relative of the state branches. And the same was true in the Conservative side of politics. When the Liberal Party was established in the 1940s, they had also a federal apparatus, but it was essentially the states that did hold the purse strings. They had more power, right up until really the late 1960s, early 1970s, when the parties finally worked out how to use federal machinery to execute a truly national, centralised election campaign. It's time, turn on the lights. In this fundamental respect, the 1918 Act was way ahead of parties and of political practice. So the second thing to mention is the Act's relatively light regulatory touch on parties and on candidates. The Act just assumes that candidates will run campaigns of public meetings, newspaper advertising, leaflets, that they'll send telegrams and hire committee rooms, because that was the practice of the day. But it leaves it up to the candidates to determine their strategy, to determine what they'll say. It doesn't seem to seek to regulate what they say, who they say it to, where or when they say it. And it follows from this that the Act is technology neutral. In fact, in some respects, it was already technologically out of date, the best example of that being the provision which bans the bribery of voters by horse or carriage hire to get them to and from the polls. Of course, you know, parties being parties, they were already onto the motor car in 1918 to get them to and from the poll. That was not strictly illegal. There was, and that wasn't repealed, I'm told, until the 1980s, the horse and carriage bribery. But there's quite a lot in the Act which the parties have basically superseded. So the original timetable for campaigns, 37 days from the issue of writs to polling day, has obviously been overrun by the permanent campaign, the extended pre-campaign period of advertising. The original idea of voting on Saturday, which still obviously remains in the Act, which was designed for the convenience of the working man, it has also been undermined with the current rise of pre-polling, oddly enough, for the convenience of working people who find weekday voting now more convenient. So basically this is laissez-faire regulation. It's technology neutral, and I think this allowed the Act to accommodate the continuing waves of technological, of communications change, of newspapers, radio, television, digital campaign. That's maybe part of the secret of the durability of the Act. And it's also worth pointing out that in one important respect, and Peter also touched on this, namely in relation to the electoral role, the Act really empowered dynamic campaign change. So this Act says, requires compulsory enrolment. Voters provide their name, their address, their occupation and their sex on a single national roll that was continuously updated and available for public inspection. They wouldn't have known, of course, that this was provided such a helpful, such a critical tool in the development of the current practice of targeting campaigns, where parties are gathering vast amounts of databases of personal information about voters based on that electoral roll, which has been used for direct mail campaigns since the 1980s and for the fieldwork campaign of the current decade. So it was national in scope, it was light touch regulation, It was also highly partisan in content. And you could make a whole separate, in fact, I think it'd be a really interesting kind of study, the partisan content of this. This act was not the product of statesmen. They were flesh and blood politicians. And I think on both sides, I want to acknowledge that I'm sure they were conscious of their responsibility to protect, promote democratic practice in Australia, but they wanted to do so in a way that maximised the advantage to their own electoral interests. So especially in relation to the banner achievement of this act, preferential voting, I'll just quickly summarise. Gavin Souter has got this in much greater detail, as have others, but there's two levels going on. One is in relation to by-elections. So first past the post was a worry, which was the prevailing system, was a worry to the nationalists as the Farmers' Party was arising, and also Soldiers' Party as well. But the Farmers' Party, the forerunner of the Country Party, threatened to split the Conservative vote, which in first past the post terms would possibly allow Labor to come through even in safe Conservative seats. Preferential voting would obviously allow a farmer's voter to cast a second vote preference for the Nationalists. In May of 1918, in the Flinders by-election, the Farmers' Party had basically railroaded the Nationalists. They threatened to run a campaign against Stanley Melbourne Bruce, as it turned out, against the Nationalist candidate, and only agreed to withdraw the candidate in exchange for a promise that the Nationalists would legislate preferential voting. So that's the kind of party context of preferential voting. Labor, on the other hand, somewhat fancied its chances under first past the post, and it was highly dramatic. In October, the legislation had already been introduced, second reading speech had been delivered, and the by-election for the seat of Swan came up, recently vacated by the even more recently deceased Sir John Forrest, a nationalist stronghold if ever there was one. Labor fielded a 22-year-old Gallipoli veteran, and he, against three other candidates, a nationalist, farmers and an independent, he won. 34.4% of the vote. He won. So there's this amazing contest about who is going to be better off electorally under preferential voting, and Labor actually was against preferential voting on this ground. There's another more subterranean level of politics going on, much less well known. It's to do with pre-selection. Labor's disciplined pre-selection system concentrated its vote, saved it from the splitters and the spoilers of the left and right. The Conservatives regarded it as very not cricket, you know. I mean, this was very dubious practice to allow the party backroom people to select a candidate rather than having the voters select the candidates. So Paddy Glynn, the Minister for Home and Territories, whose legislation this was, saw preferential voting as an opportunity not just to fulfil the promise to the Farmers' Party, but actually to fix this insidious, nasty practice of party pre-selection, basically allowing any candidate to run with or without pre-selection and let the voters decide. And I think this is why in the second reading debate, when Frank Tudor got up to speak with the tailwind of the Swan by-election the previous weekend, he accused the government of using the bill to try to wipe out the Labor Party. He said this by interjection in Paddy Glynn's speech. It's not in Hansard, but it was reported in the press. And he repeated it in his own speech. My opinion is that it has been designed, this legislation has been designed by the Minister and the Cabinet with the express purpose of trying to injure the party on this side of the House. There's a lot more that could be said about the partisanship here. I haven't even talked about postal voting or compulsory voting, both of which were highly partisan. But suffice to say that 100 years ago, the law was being used as a battleground, electoral law was being used as a battleground in the contest between the parties, a pattern which in path-dependent fashion continues to this day. A bit conscious of time, I'll skip the campaign finance. It's fascinating. Let's do it in questions. I'll just simply say the legislation was fatally flawed. It set spending limits which the candidates ignored. Why? The legislation failed to acknowledge the existence of political parties. It tried to control everybody else's spending, didn't even mention political parties. The whole act in this regard was a paper tiger, really. So to conclude, we are celebrating the centenary of a significant legislative achievement. The Commonwealth shouldered the obligation to operate and to fund the electoral system that provided a stable framework ever since. Australian electoral administration was put in and remains in safe hands. And if majority decisions are what you want, well, preferential voting is your answer. As we saw with Wentworth, 16 candidates, one candidate got a majority. But let's also not forget the partisan calculation that operated 100 years ago, and guess what, still does. Further major surgery is needed on this Act, especially on the campaign finance provision. And so on that note, let me close by referring to another anniversary. This is the 10th anniversary of John Faulkner's Electoral Reform Green Paper. I thought Faulkner was the best by far of the recent electoral reformers, wise in the ways of party campaigning and wise in the values of democracy. There was a very good reform package that was proposed there 10 years ago. It would have restored financial integrity to our system, but the opportunity was blocked by the then opposition, and I think we're still living with the consequences of that, increasingly negative consequences. So I shall leave it with that, and thank you very much.
Thanks, Steve.
I'm going to stand up if that's all right. Well, following on from both Peter and Stephen, I'd obviously like to thank the organisers for the invitation to talk here today. After 25 years working on both sides of the fence, it's interesting to be asked to reflect on parliamentary perspectives on electoral reform. I'm in the very happy position of being on gardening leave pending retirement, and it's as I was saying to Phil Green a minute ago, it's a great place to be. But as a number of people know, and it's great to see some old friends here, my formative years were spent under the mentorship of people like Bill Gray, who's here today, Phil, Michael Maley and various other people in the room, where I followed the dubious calling of spin doctor, communications branch, whatever you want to call it, explaining the electoral process to candidates, to political parties, to the public, to the media and so on. So I suppose if my professional education was at the AEC, if my basic training was at the AEC, coming to the Senate at the end of my career was some sort of finishing school. But it was certainly very interesting to follow the trail from candidate to parliamentarian, because having worked with a lot of senators and also a number of MPs, I came to see their way of thinking about the electoral process from a completely different view that I never was able to get when I worked at the Electoral Commission. So I think the first thing I was thinking when I was preparing for this is that both as an electoral official and as a parliamentary officer, we sometimes can't see the election for the process. Because as professional administrators, we tend to think that elections almost have a life of their own, and any of us who've worked at the Electoral Commission know that. And I think it's a bit more than our friend, the first Commissioner or Chief Electoral Officer, saying you spring into life. But you know, it's very important that Australia can draw on the services of highly trained electoral officials who have a deep understanding and commitment to both electoral law, LAW, but also electoral law, LORE. And that was envisaged, as both Peter and Stephen have been talking about, from the earliest days. When you work in a place like this at Parliament House, one of the things you learn is that obviously elections are very important to parliamentarians, but they're a cause rather than effect. Every parliamentarian I've ever worked with in 10 years is very aware of their professional mortality. You know, whether it's a redistribution, whether it's pre-selection, which is not really covered in the Electoral Act, whether it's tomorrow's headline. Look what happened in New South Wales last week. Whereas I think when we worked at the AEC, and certainly when working here in the Senate, we tended to see elections almost as a beast in their own right. So I'm going to give you some subjective and selective views. They're of course very personal because I'm technically still on the payroll of the Senate Department, so I'm speaking, personally. The other issue, a point was made a little while ago by Stephen about, topics for future study, and I think there are a number of them. And the whole issue of, parliamentary views on electoral reform, I reckon, has got a thesis in it. And, I think it would be a really interesting study to do at some stage, because going back reading old Hansards and journals just in the last couple of weeks, it's an embarrassment of riches. The other point that Michael made to me when we were discussing this is that most, electoral law is a very interesting thing for parliamentarians to do because they have a stake in it. And there's the spectre of self-interest, but there's also the fact that quite often there's a lack of understanding. And even within the two major parties, there are, as Michael put it very elegantly when we were chatting about this, there are groups within groups, depending on local conditions, for example. Stephen's just been talking about the partisanship and, I suppose, naked self-interest. And I spent a lot of time when I was in the Senate talking to public servants, getting them ready for estimates. And I used to remind them that politics happens in this place, and we should not be surprised that politics happens here. And certainly, when I was a young lad at the AEC, because, we wanted to be non-partisan and equitable, we tended to sort of not be politically wise. And people are sometimes surprised when politics happens here. Nonetheless, I do think that the various checks, balances and intrinsic accommodations of politics and the parliamentary process do tend to sort of find their own level. One of the things people like Michael taught me years ago is, that there's no perfect electoral system. And any of us who've done work overseas know that, helping other countries with their elections. I would suggest there's no such thing as a perfect electoral act. It's got to be a work in progress. And, as we've already seen from the previous contributors, that's something that we've now got. It goes right back to the 19th century. So the first thing I'd like to start with is the fact that, we know that Australia has led the way in building the machinery of electoral administration that Peter touched on. The other thing I love to remember is Marion Sawyer's comment that Australia is the first country to vote itself into existence. And that's really powerful. We voted for the constitutional referendums, constitutional conventions of the 1890s, and there's that wonderful book that our late colleague Glenn Rhodes did where he mapped the data of how people voted in those elections. It's a fabulous book if you can ever get hold of it. The other thing that we tend to overlook a little bit is the North American influence on our system. People always talk about the Westminster system. Well, the great late Harry Evans used to talk about the Washminster system. And one of the things I was very fond of saying, and still am fond of saying, is the Senate is not a House of Lords. We have states, we're a federation. Andrew Inglis Clark, who was one of the great people behind the Constitution, he visited the United States, ironically on the way back from an appeal to the Privy Council about a railway matter in Tassie. But if you go back and look at the debates, there were lots of references to the US and lots of references to places like Switzerland, as well as references to the UK. And one of the things, and Peter touched on this, is that local government was not very well, I think you said it was limited. And that was one of the reasons from the earliest days that the state took control. And so many things that we take for granted, the secret ballot, continuous electoral roll, franchise for women and so on, were actually, were talked about in the 1890s in the constitutional conventions, and they were talked about in 1902. In fact, the third sitting day of the fledgling parliament in 1901 on the 21st of May, Richard Crouch, who was the member for Corio, seconded the motion to adopt that absolutely silly thing called the address in reply. But he talked about the fact, because the address in reply, you can talk about whatever you want. There's no limit on the debate, on the subject matter. And he talked about the need for a uniform franchise and a uniform electoral law. We go forward to 1902. They're debating a public service bill, which I would have thought was pretty pressing because they've got to build this new nation. But they're also debating the need to have, as Senator O'Connor said, a principle of absolute uniformity and equality of representation throughout the Commonwealth. And, we live in a human world, we live in an imperfect world, but I think it's very impressive that this notion of having a uniform electoral system exercised legislators in the 1890s when they were getting ready for federation. It exercised them in 1902. The other sort of thing I'd like to think about is that for both candidates and for parliamentarians, rules matter. Because if you're smart and you've got clear, uniform rules, you can use them to your advantage. Any of us who've worked at the AEC, and those who still work at the AEC, have spent a lot of time explaining what the rules are. If you've ever looked at either house and you see the two impassive clerks sitting at the table, what do? They're explaining the rules. So the Speaker or the President is chairing the meeting, which is what a meeting of either house is, a sitting of either house is, but senators or members are coming over and saying, I want to do this, how do I do it? And you explain it to them. Well, the standing orders let you do this. Interestingly, the Senate got right down to business. Section 50 of the Constitution says that the rules of the House of Commons applied at the beginning and they can make their own rules. The Senate got down in 1903 and set its standing orders in place very quickly. Once again, people want rules. They like rules. So while the 1918 legislation consolidation, gets the limelight, I think we need to remember that I think it was pretty heroic that in 1902, with so many other things to do, they did an Electoral Act and also a Franchise Act. But where's the devil reside? In the detail. So even in the 1902 debates, Senator Simon from South Australia is complaining about the details. He said, I won't read the whole quote, but he actually says, I don't understand what we're talking about. I'm bewildered. And he says, if I'm bewildered, what about the man in the street? Read into that, the man or woman in the street. I would suggest that back in 2016, when they were debating the changes to the Senate voting system, the officials who would have been sitting in the advisors' box in both houses would have really earned their money, because particularly when you're talking about Senate voting systems. So not a lot's changed. And that probably leads us to the fact, to go back to my earlier point, that there's often quite a lot that the average senator or member doesn't necessarily understand about tax, about defence, about the Murray-Darling Basin, about the Electoral Act. Because particularly if you're from the major parties, you have a head office or a national secretariat, and they tend to do it for you. That's one of the sort of interesting things, because if politics is an amateur pursuit, and that's a discussion for another day, it's quite interesting the sorts of questions we get at the AEC. It's quite interesting the sort of questions we get in the Senate, which of course, if they're about elections, I'm always happy to send to Phil Dyack. But I'd just like to do two little quick case studies to give you a flavour. In 1918, Peter said that everyone has their favourite thing about the 1918 Act. Well, my favourite thing is what happened when they were debating the 1918 Act, because Stephen's talked about the Swan by-election. The Swan by-election was absolutely fascinating because Labor came straight through the middle. And Albert Gardner was a New South Wales Labor senator. And one of the quotes about him in the Biographical Dictionary of the Australian Senate is that he was given to speaking often and at length. He was very unhappy about this because they'd passed the bill in the House the previous week, sent it through to the Senate the following week, and he wanted more information. He believed, though, the government was trying to push this through. There's another study for the Parliamentary Library to do, Jonathan, and that is every time there's an electoral bill, the government seems to want more time to do it. They moved a motion last week to extend, to guillotine the bill. So Gardner said, OK, there were no time limits in those days. He got up at 10:03 p.m. on the 13th of November, and he read the entire bill, which is normally something the clerk does. He read the entire bill, including its schedule, and droned on for 12 hours and 40 minutes. Now, the legacy of Gardner was that the standing orders were reviewed shortly after that, and time limits were brought in. So what's the other job you do if you're sitting clerking at the table in the deputy clerk's seat? You're working the clock. Get the clock wrong, it's the loneliest place to be, because every senator takes an interest in the clock. Now, history's not been very kind to Senator Gardner, and I certainly wouldn't have wanted to have been stuck on a railway carriage next to him going back to Sydney. But he was using the rules as they applied at the time to be a politician, that's what happens here, and to seek more information. I think it's also led to a very important change in the way the Senate and also the House works now, that there are time limits for different contributions. let's just finish with another quick study. We haven't talked about 1948 yet, and if you work in the Senate, 1948 is really important. The Chifley government wanted to introduce proportional representation using the single transferable vote that we know and love. And it led to the Red Room, the Senate, becoming a much more powerful institution and an institution fulfilling what its founders probably envisaged for it. If it's interesting if you go back and look at the Hansard, because guess what? Politics again. Opposition leader Mr Menzies noted in the second reading debates, he said, "This is indecent, it's a racket," quote unquote. And yet we know that proportional representation had been discussed as far back as 1902. It's in the 1902 debates. And the Chifley government, the received wisdom is the Chifley government was going to lose the election. They had 33 of the 36 seats in the Senate, so they're always going to get it through the Senate, and they would get better representation after the election. It's interesting how everyone lined up to remind the Labor Party that part of its platform was the abolition of the Senate. But in the end, of course, there was sort of something in it for everyone. They came to an accommodation. And particularly Archie Cameron, who was one of the most killjoy speakers this place has ever had. He had a photo of Phar Lap taken down because he thought it encouraged gambling. Archie Cameron had had a complete humour bypass. He hoed into the Labor members about what he saw as the hypocrisy, but then at the end, before he sat down, said, "But I support it," because he could see that it would help the Country Party, the Nationals. So, what can we conclude from this brief reflection? I think it needs a lot more consideration, which we can't do justice to in 15 minutes. One of the things I think, both working in the Parliament and working in the electoral administration bodies, we have to be aware of politics. And I think at very senior levels, at commissioner level, at those sort of, the people who have input to the Joint Standing Committee on Electoral Matters, that comes with the turf. But I think as organisations, sometimes we're so busy being tied up with the detail of the process that escapes us. It's always going to be interesting that the law to administer elections is made by members of Parliament. But it's, we've been looking at the United States in the last week. Years ago, I went to a conference, I think it was in Mexico City, and I was on a panel like this next to a very senior electoral official from the United States. And she quite happily got up in a room like this and said, "Well, I'm a Republican." She didn't blush, and I needed a defibrillator, because that was just completely anathema to the way we work. Personally, and this is a very personal view, I still think there are some areas that need looking at. Things like the party involvement in the postal vote process. I mean, I personally find that an absolute scandal, and it really worries me because it's designed to look like the AEC form. The use of electoral roll data, which has been, now we live in an electronic age, and of course the major political parties are exempt from the Privacy Act. So I can't see what political parties have with my roll data. Just to finish up, when I was Usher of the Black Rod, which is the best job title in the Commonwealth, when I was Usher of the Black Rod, one of my responsibilities was security in this place with the sergeant. And I worked for 3 presidents of the Senate, and I said to each one of them that there were 226 separate points of view about security in this place. And I think we could say there are at least 226 points of view about the Electoral Act. Because even within the major parties, if you talk to someone from central Queensland, they may have a quite different view to someone from metropolitan Sydney about particular aspects of the Act. We do have a uniform system as was envisaged. It's not perfect because it is a work in progress, but we only have to look at what was happening last week overseas to just realise how lucky we are. The other thing I'll finish off with is saying that most parliamentarians do take a longer term view. They know that what goes around comes around. When there have been leadership spills on both sides, I remember a number of senators, we don't say anything, but people talk to us and we just sort of nod and don't comment. And I remember a very senior senator saying to me, I think when Mr Turnbull got rolled the first time round, and he said, "I'm not taking any joy in this." He said, because what goes around comes around. And I think the smart politicians are aware of that. And that's where we should finish by giving a particular sort of bouquet to the Joint Standing Committee on Electoral Matters, because it is not only a great repository of input from officials, from parties, from citizens, from interest groups, but it's also been the major driver of electoral reform in this country. And I think that committee and its work over the last nearly 3 decades hasn't been given enough credit. And on that, I'll finish.
Thank you. I too would like to thank the organisers for the invitation. I'm officially the discussant for this seminar, which is a great burden of responsibility. It's actually the first time I've been involved in an event to mark the 100th anniversary of a piece of legislation other than the Constitution, and I'm mournful of lost opportunities to celebrate, for example, the Crimes Act 1914 or the Customs Act 1901, particularly since I'm confident I won't make their bicentenary. In preparing for this session, I dutifully Googled tips on how to be a good discussant and found the following helpful advice. A discussant has two distinct tasks: to discuss the papers and help foment a discussion among the panellists and perhaps even the audience. Many people make a serious mistake and overemphasise the former task to the detriment of the latter. And since our speakers have presented papers of great interest and lucidity, thus removing the need to forensically dissect them, I suspect the desire for discussion is already well fomented, I shall endeavour to be brief. I'd like to take a romantic view of electoral frameworks, which I know is challenging since the Act could be said by a critical observer to be somewhat dry, and note that electoral frameworks such as set out in the 1918 Act and all its subsequent amendments are of intrinsic importance, for they embody in their provisions both a nation's aspirations and expectations as modulated through their elected representatives. My favourite aspect of the Act is the franchise. And as Stephen notes, although political equality is a core democratic value, adult suffrage was not in fact universal in Australia in the 1902 Act, or indeed in the 1918 Act. This despite the words of Richard O'Connor in introducing the original franchise bill. We do not want to have any proportion of our community disenfranchised and in a position of political inferiority, having no right to a voice in the making of laws. It would be a great mistake from every point of view to have any portion of the community in such a position that, while it had to obey the law, it would have no right in the election of those who had to make the laws. And while the franchise extended to natural-born or naturalised subjects of the king resident in Australia for a 6-month period continuously, with the exception of those under sentence attainted of treason or of unsound mind, as Stephen has noted, Australia's First Peoples and the Indigenous peoples of other nations were effectively excluded from the Commonwealth Franchise Act from the very beginning. At a national level, it is sobering to reflect that voting rights were only restored to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples in Australia through a very slow and gradual process, with the Commonwealth vote not given to all Indigenous Australians until as late as 1962. This brings me to a theme underlying each of the presentations, namely how fundamental electoral systems are to the legitimacy of a democracy. Saw's quote about Australia becoming the first nation to invent itself through the ballot box is salient. We all owe a debt to Brian for reminding us of the sterling efforts of Senator Gardner in reading the whole electoral bill into Hansard, which leads me to reflect that the Electoral Act 1918 also occasioned the first use of the guillotine in the Australian Parliament. Given this has proved such a useful feature of standing orders over the past 100 years, it perhaps deserves its own commemoration. Conversations about the partisan and political nature of debate on electoral reform are of course, ongoing. We must recall that the Constitution for whom the Australian people voted grouped its electoral provisions into two categories. Some are perpetual and can be varied only by referenda, such as the nexus between the houses, the requirement that senators and members be directly elected by the people, or Section 44 dealing with candidate eligibility, the spectre of which has stalked the 45th Parliament. However, other provisions had effect only until the Parliament otherwise presides, and devising the operational details of the electoral system thus fell to the newly created Parliament. The architects of the Constitution, unsurprisingly perhaps, placed great faith in the capacity of elected senators and members to designate law for a system of representative self-government, notwithstanding that they would be legislating in their own interest. History would suggest that this faith was justified. Two of our papers focused on the complex role of the Parliament, which more or less enthusiastically established and greatly extended Australia's national administration for voter registration and the conduct of elections. And the fact that it is national is significant. As our speakers have noted, the Electoral Act is itself a product of a mix of idealism, pragmatism, and perhaps, as Brian pointed out, ignorance, with the immediate catalyst being to introduce preferential voting as a result of the results in recent by-elections, most notably in Swan. But of course, as Peter's paper reminds us, political reforms always have a history and sometimes a long gestation. And federal parliamentary debates on the issue of preferential voting had occurred in the context of colonial parliaments and had been originally proposed for the House of Representatives in the 1902 bill but didn't survive. And of course, they figured in Cook's election policy in 1914. Though composed of election winners, Parliament is more than the sum of the interests of the political parties represented in it. And parliamentarians are themselves not unconscious that there is an interplay between what has been termed the spectre of self-interest and the broader principle of national interest and nation building, of a responsibility to protect and promote democratic process. So the Minister for Home and Territories, Patrick Glynn, introducing the 1918 bill, said, "It is our duty not to allow party or personal interests to touch too much the consideration of electoral methods and to make, as far as political temperaments and motives may permit, democracy effective for government." And as our speakers have noted, the outcome of the debate on the electoral bill, with all its partisan elements, was a durable and stable national framework. It's worth contemplating also the ongoing process of electoral reform since 1918 in that nation-building role. Parliamentarians have voted to establish an independent electoral commission to remove the conduct of elections from political influence, and they have voted to divest themselves of the power to determine electoral boundaries and distributions, though the power to influence those had been very handy. It's also notable that over the past years, Commonwealth parliaments have also enacted legislation requiring or compelling, to an unusual extent, active citizen engagement with the electoral system. They established a broad franchise. They require first compulsory registration and then in 1924 compulsory voting, and lowering the voting age from 21 to 18. Faced with the problem of informality, parliaments have, inter alia, legislated saving measures to save ballots which don't comply with official requirements, to minimise the exclusion of voting papers, provided intention is apparent. The first such saving provision was put in place, I understand, in the 1918 Electoral Act to assist the transition from first past the post to preferential voting. And as Brian has noted, the Joint Standing Committee on Electoral Matters, established in 1983, has made a substantial contribution to electoral reform, conducting inquiries into the conduct of each general election and into specific issues, and becoming a key forum for public debate on electoral matters. It is the conduit through which commissions and the public can reach those who make electoral law. Of course, as has been noted, it's not always possible for parliaments or parliamentarians to predict or foresee the outcomes of complex electoral provisions. The introduction of the group vote ticket or above-the-line voting in the Senate in 1984 on the recommendation of the then Australian Electoral Office is a case in point. The new provisions met the objective of reducing high rates of informal voting in the Senate. However, it was not foreseen, or at least perhaps not widely foreseen, that it also gave power over preferences to parties that did not otherwise campaign, enabling the phenomena of preference whispering, which saw candidates elected to the Senate on very low first preference votes. This system, of course, was changed in 2016 on the recommendations of the Joint Standing Committee on Electoral Matters. All three papers make the point that the legacy of the Act we are celebrating is an electoral system that has worked well and has garnered international recognition for this. Peter's paper reminds us of the significance of Australia's election management body and the importance of professional and independent electoral officials to the process of free and fair elections. At the last federal election, the AEC trained and marshalled some 75,000 casual employees across more than 7,000 polling places nationally. The challenge this poses are considerable and the achievement great. This is perhaps something we don't reflect upon until the system fails, as it did rather dramatically in 2013 in Western Australia. However, we may reflect that there were systems in place to enable the anomaly of lost ballots to be identified, the cause determined, and orderly processes put in place to remedy the defect. The Economist magazine's Democracy Index again last year awarded Australia a perfect score of 10 against its electoral process and pluralism criteria, one of only 8 countries to achieve this result. This year, Australia received full marks, 12 out of 12, for its electoral processes and for political pluralism and participation, 16 out of 16 for the latter, from Freedom House against the criteria of a competitive multi-party political system, universal adult suffrage, regularly contested elections with ballot security and significant public access. However, other data suggests that despite this, there are worrying signs to which we should be paying regard in this centenary year of the Act. Stephen's paper notes the need for ongoing reform, particularly in the area of campaign finance. Clearly, we're not immune to the growing international trends in public dissatisfaction with politics. Following the introduction of compulsory voting in 1924, turnout rates at elections have been consistently high, with post-war figures showing a turnout trend of around 95% of registered voters. Generally, voting has been perceived as a civic duty, and the Commission has ensured that generally voting is relatively painless, enlivened through local efforts by the democracy sausage. There are high levels of electoral integrity and a perceived legitimacy, an actual and perceived legitimacy of process and outcomes. But the AEC vote for the 2016 election found turnout at the House of Representatives at 91% was the lowest recorded since the introduction of compulsory voting. The Australian Electoral Study 2016 found that satisfaction with democracy was at its lowest level since the time of the 1975 dismissal of the Whitlam government. In 2016, just 60% of respondents were either very or fairly satisfied with democracy, compared to 86% in 2007, a decline of 26 percentage points in under 10 years. Trust in politicians was at its lowest level since the question was first asked in 1969. In 2016, no less than 3/4 of the respondents believed that people in government look after themselves. Unsurprisingly, perhaps in this context, the study found record low levels of voter interest and engagement in the election, less satisfaction and alignment with parties, and an increase in voting volatility. The 2018 Idleman Trust Barometer also points to a decline in trust in government and across each of the measured sectors amongst the general population, putting us in the category of countries with extreme trust losses. The survey concludes that trust is placed in individuals, not institutions, and that the value of expertise has increased. Sadly, these studies do not immediately yield easy solutions. Fortunately for me, my duty is only to foment discussion, and having pointed out the apparent dichotomy between the strength of our democratic framework and the erosion of confidence in it, I will retire honourably from the list and invite further insights from our panel and audience. Thank you.
I'd now like to open up to questions, contributions from the floor. We have a microphone at each side of the room, which I believe is connected. So perhaps the first person who would care to raise a question could make his or her way to the microphone, and we'll find out.
Okay, well, I have a question. Can each of us briefly state what is the most important thing to change about the Electoral Act?
Campaign finance, without any shadow of doubt. We've got a real problem with money in elections. The Commonwealth Act lags behind many of the state acts, lags behind international practice. You could do it through caps on spending, caps on donations. The constitutional prohibitions there or restrictions, I think, can be worked through, and certainly through improved disclosure. The disclosure provisions in the 1918 Act were that each candidate had to fill out a stat deck and allocate their, declare their expenditure within 8 weeks. I mean, how we would love 8 weeks now. It's more than 12 months before you find out the expenditure by the receipts by the parties, and even then, you know, you don't really find much. So campaign finance, it's just a wound in the Act.
I think I've touched on mine, but my bugbear is the parties, and it's particularly the major parties getting involved in postal voting. That they were taken to court by the AEC 2 decades ago. The Act was changed, and it blurs the necessary distinction between the non-political administration of an election by a body such as the AEC and the role of the parties. And I think that's, I also agree about the finance too, but my personal bugbear is postal voting and the use of electoral roll data to do that.
I, of course, do not have personal views as an official, but I would note that that the issue of campaign financing is one that continues to bedevil debate in the Parliament.
I might offer a couple of observations myself at this point. Firstly, on Brian's point, I am watching with some interest as to whether the recent legislation which bans impersonation of Commonwealth entities, which flowed from the Medibank card campaigning that was done at the 2016 election, is going to capture some of the stuff that's put out in association with postal voting applications by parties, where voters in the past, for example, have been invited to return their postal vote applications to, quote, the returning officer, unquote, it not being made clear that the returning officer in question is an official of a political party rather than the divisional returning officer. Second observation I'd make is that there is still a problem in the Commonwealth Electoral Act with the requirement for full preferential voting for the House of Representatives in an environment where it is increasingly challenging for voters to know what are the political positions of the smorgasbord of candidates who may be presented to them, particularly if they don't campaign, and therefore it becomes one of the very few official documents on which voters are legally required to lie by expressing or purporting to express preferences which they don't genuinely hold. Peter, do you want to come in on that?
I agree with all of those. My little bugbear is about the Senate. I think it's underrated as a cause of much of the modern malaise. It was devised in the 1890s before there were political parties. It was supposed to represent the states, but it just represents the parties. And it's so hard for governments these days with a swelling crossbench to pass legislation. We obviously can't change the Constitution. So I think, and we're also very unusual in having single-member electorates in the lower house and PR in the upper house, and that really creates a division between the two houses in that to form government, generally a party doesn't have to form alliances or coalitions, the coalitionist, the big C coalition aside, and that leaves them on their own upstairs, whereas if you have PR in both houses, that you have form alliances. We had an example of that, the Gillard government and the Greens. The Gillard government had no problems in the upper house because to pass anything in the lower house, they had to get the Greens on side. So I think to fix this, we can't change the Constitution. We need to change the electoral systems and have maybe PR in both houses, or at least PR in the lower house and possibly whatever in the upper house, but PR in both possibly.
Sorry, as technically still a good Senate officer, can I respond to Peter? I think the years of the Gillard government, and we said to our colleagues in the House at the time, this is the way we've been doing business in the Senate for years. I just want to challenge the the commonly held belief that the Senate is no longer a state's house. My experience is that if you're a senator from Western Australia and you're talking about GST, you're talking about a state's house. Of course, the party systems are strong. The other sort of furphy is that the Senate blocks everything. Some stats were put up on the Senate website last week about the amount of legislation that had been passed. And of course, the media never follow the fact that how many bills went through and the high levels of cooperation or whatever word you want. In fact, there's a time set aside on Thursday for what's known as non-contro leg, where both sides agree on it and it gets passed very, very quickly. The Senate's about quality control. Thank you.
Especially if you're Tasmanian.
This raises perhaps another question which Peter might like to reflect on, was whether it was a mistake to increase the size of the Parliament and whether the size of the Senate in 1984, which reduced the quota for election to the Senate, particularly at double dissolutions, and in some ways has rendered the double dissolution process so unattractive after the experience in particular of 2016 that it has changed in a way the balance of influence between the two houses. And I'd be interested to hear, Peter, or any of the panel on that.
I have really no reflection on that, Michael.
I'll have my two bobs worth. If we want a representative democracy, there are different ways we do it. We do it one way in the House of Representatives, at a district level. We do it at a provincial or state level in the Senate. Odgers Chapter 1 is the best reading you can ever have on why we have a federation. But I do take Michael's point that, the 7% quota you get for double dissolution means you get a very disparate crossbench. But we're talking about representation, folks. Australia's a very diverse country. So, what's wrong with having a Ricky Muir or a Pauline Hanson or whoever? Because people voted for them. Now, the system, remember I said the system ain't perfect. There's no such thing as a perfect electoral system or a perfect act. But, I live in Eden Monaro and whoever, it's winner take all in a marginal seat. So 49 point whatever % of people in Eden Monaro didn't vote for the person who's the member, no disrespect to the member of either persuasion. In the Senate, you have a variety of views, and Odgers Chapter 1 goes through that I think in very good detail. You can hear Harry Evans talking because he re-edited it.
I now do have you can't really put Ricky Muir and Pauline Hanson together because Ricky Muir was elected with about 10 votes or something like that. So he's pre the changes which were great. The 2016 changes were really good. But yeah, you can't. If people want to elect Pauline, whoever.
Can I just say one, just to have a very tiny thing, 12 senators not only per state, not only creates the huge disparity between populous states and small states, not only creates a lower quota for double dissolutions, but also makes it very, very difficult to think about future states being admitted to the Constitution, to the Commonwealth. You're never going to get Northern Territory, or you shouldn't get Northern Territory or the ACT if that means 12 senators. Yeah. It's just wrong.
The interesting thing with the ACT and the Northern Territory, if the Northern Territory was admitted as a state, it won't be an original state, the ACT is never going to be made a state, but it's got a population that probably in future years is going to overtake that of the Northern Territory. Now, I think it was someone came up with an ingenious solution about 20 years ago that if you made the parliamentary precinct the ACT and then had a regional city of Canberra in the state of New South Wales, that could be one way to solve that. But
John Stone.
Yeah, John Stone, thank you. Yeah.
Yep.
Hello, is it coming through? Following on from the recent discussion, it was noted that there's been increased disillusionment with politics in recent years in Australia, and perhaps as a result of that, we've had an increase in numbers of both minor parties in the Senate and independents of minor parties elected in the House of Representatives. And here I must admit I take a fairly strong view that the more different people who are represented, the better, because perhaps people who are disillusioned at least see they've got the chance of getting their views heard. The question I want to ask is in relation to some aspects of the Electoral Act which make it difficult for independents and minor parties. I'm particularly referring to above the line voting in the Senate, where basically an independent can't stand and therefore, and it's much harder for them to get in. That also And the above-the-line process also affects the chances of people choosing which Senate candidate they want, noting we have had a couple of instances of the people choosing not the preferred candidate from the parties. So I'm just asking for comments as to whether the Electoral Act could be amended in the light of the rise of independents and minor parties.
Well, I'm not sure. I mean, I think more people could be encouraged to vote below the line. I'm not sure that's a problem that's stopping minor parties getting into the Senate. I mean, they just have to get above the line. I mean, it is good. More Tasmanians vote below the line than mainlanders, and that's because they're used to it with their own system, and that's a good thing, isn't it? It shows they're exercising their minds and differentiating between candidates. But I'm not sure the above the line ticket is obviously disadvantages anyone who's not above the line, but who just really remains an independent. But as long as they become a party, they get above the line.
There are also some fairly tight restrictions on becoming parties these days.
Sorry?
There are also restrictions on how to become a party these days, number of members you need and that sort of thing.
Right, yeah.
Probably an interesting comment to add to what Peter said and to help you, sir. The changes to the Electoral Act in 2016 meant that if you vote below the line, as a good AEC, protege, I've always voted below the line, but I live in New South Wales, so I get a ballot paper this big. The changes in 2016 meant you don't have to number every square, so I'm not, as Michael was talking about, forced to put a preference for someone I've never heard of. Interesting stuff happening in Victoria. Anthony Green's running, I think, a really useful campaign on Twitter to get Victorians, because they still have a ticket system that can be gamed, and Mr Drury is allegedly involved in it. And Green is actually running a very strong campaign getting Victorians to vote below the line, because they only have to number 5 squares, or they can keep going, but a minimum 5, and the vote will be formal. And interestingly, my daughter, who's a university student in Melbourne, rang me yesterday, and she's voting in her first Victorian election, and she said, can you tell me how to vote below the line? Not for whom, but how it works. And I thought the message must be getting through. So,
that's great. An observation on above the line, below the line voting is that reforms take place in the particular context of the problems that are prevalent at the time, and in the run-up to the introduction of above-the-line voting, overwhelmingly the greatest deficiency in the Senate electoral process was the high level of informal voting, which exceeded 9% at every election from 1970 to 1983, simply because people had to number every candidate individually, which in the case of New South Wales in 1974 was numbering from 1 to 73 without any mistakes. So above-the-line voting had unintended consequences and developed in the way that it has functioned because of changing strategies by the political parties, which is an endemic feature of electoral reform, that what works quite happily for 20 years suddenly ceases to work as different political parties adjust their strategies around the opportunities which they perceive there. And so you need a different reform and a different system. One there and then there. Yeah. And then there.
Thank you. I wonder, following that last comment, and I've been following Anthony Green's Twitter campaign to encourage people in the Victorian election. I think it's for the upper house only to number only a small number of squares. Do any of the panel members have a view as to any downsides of implementing full optional preferential voting for both houses of federal parliament? Thank you.
I personally think it's a really good idea because, and Michael's point's a good one. Wentworth by-election, I think you had 16 candidates. Now it was a by-election, it was a special case, but you had 16 candidates. So even in the House of Reps, and in an urban, pretty focused electorate, you may not have known what every one of them stood for. It's a nightmare in the Senate. So my personal view, as a citizen and as an elector, is I think it's a good idea. But other people have different views.
I'm in favour of OPV for sure. It's a bit more complicated for the upper house. I mean, we now do have OPV in the upper house even though it's optional above the line, but the Electoral Commission lies to voters effectively and says you must number at least 6, and that's quite good actually. I think because it means that people are encouraged. I think it's good to encourage people to number more than one. That is the downside of OPV. The big downside is especially when the major parties campaign, ostensibly they claim they're talking to their own supporters, but they're really talking to minor party supporters. They're saying just number 1, only vote 1. And I think that would need to be outlawed. Ideally that would be outlawed, and the Electoral Commission would encourage people to number, would have messages like, ensure your vote counts, number as many squares as you can. But I'm in favour of optional preferential voting.
Hi, I'm Alex. I work in the House of Reps, so I've got some allegiance here. And the Electoral Matters Committee at the moment is looking into a bill that aims to lower the voting age to 16. And I was doing some research the other day, just looking at the size or the increase in the number of electors per electorate. That's sort of a two-part question. Electors per electorate, we're now up to about an average of 107,000 electors per electorate. The size of the houses hasn't really been substantially increased since the early 80s. Assuming we were to go ahead and reduce the voting age, that's going to get worse. Is there a case for increasing the size, even looking the size of the parliament, even considering what that might do to quotas in the Senate?
Well, you just made one.
The business of average sizes of electorates can be a little bit misleading because Tasmania, that must have 5 seats, obviously has smaller numbers of electors. My personal view about young people is that I think, if you go into Coles or Woolworths on a Sunday, it's run by young people. Most young people now have a job and they're paying tax. So I think, the earlier we can get them, the better. I wouldn't make it compulsory because we know that the younger you are, the less likely you are to participate. And that goes back to work I did at the AEC 10, 15 years ago, the Youth Electoral Study. As far as the size of the electorate is concerned, different electorates have different features. So, someone from rural South Australia or Western Australia will tell you the problems they have getting around the geographical vastness of their electorates. Inner city people will tell you it's very compact, but they've got the numbers. It's horses for courses. I don't think the numbers are going to make that much difference. And it'd be very brave Parliament that tried to legislate to increase the size. I'd like to see that campaign.
Yeah. As I understand it, the real problem is just the nexus between the House and the Senate. In principle, 100,000+ electors it's a big ask. They're big electorates, although of course in the US they're not big. But for Australian practice, I think the argument that you've made, and I hadn't thought about the aspect of 16-year-old voting, but that absolutely underlines it. We've got very big electorates already, and the degree of malapportionment we're getting, not just with Tasmania, but with rural seats not being able to, as it were, keep up or become, unmanageably vast, is a real problem. So I would certainly support the argument in principle, but I just don't see how you can unpick the nexus lock.
If people want to think of one more question, I might intervene on that issue to point out that political scientists at the University of California have identified the cube root of the population of a country as a predictor of legislature sizes across national study.
What's the answer?
That's what they say.
The cube root.
Put the number in and calculate it. Yeah.
A question that reveals my ignorance, but here you go. We touched on at the beginning, particularly in Peter's talk, about the history of some of the features of the system, but we didn't talk about where the idea of compulsory registration and voting originated. Is it a particularly Australian thing, or was it a Swiss idea?
I'm not totally sure which country in the world first did it. I'll just say that it's a particularly Australian thing in the sense that the European colonisation of Australia, those people had a particular mindset, which was that if something's good for society, it doesn't hurt to make people do it. And that's like the living wage, and it sort of it can be lumped with that. But technically, I'm not sure.
And certainly the 1902 debates. I mean, Senator O'Connor, I didn't read this out in my talk, but Senator O'Connor, moving the second reading of the electoral bill in 1902, said he wants one important principle, that is to say the principle of the absolute uniformity and equality of representation throughout the Commonwealth. Now, the uniformity of representation is not just the politicians that come out one end. You've got to start with a good electoral roll. And again, Marion has done a beautiful work about the police constables in the, in the early days going around on their horses, marking up an electoral roll. And it's, AEC people know a fundamental electoral roll is the building block of a fair election.
Okay. Well, we're coming close to the end of our time available.
Can I just make one quick point on that? So, I mean, there's, maybe I misheard the question, but there are interesting and different elements of compulsion in the 1918 Act and now. So there was compulsory enrolment, and that predated the 1918 Act. There was compulsory voting, which had been toyed with under the Fisher government in kind of obscure circumstances, but then was ruled out in the 19 Act. And of course, there's compulsory preferential voting. And I'll just say, in the 1918 debate, the compulsion entailed in preferential voting, which is very clear in the Act, shocked a number of the speakers in the debate. Now, was it faux shock or was it actual shock? In other words, they didn't mind the idea of there being a preferential voting, but to make it exhaustive, to make it a full non-optional preferential vote, was seen as being kind of pushing the edges. Now, they didn't have 16 candidate by-elections in those days, so it didn't go anywhere. But I think Peter's right. I mean, there was no fundamental block in the minds of the legislators at the time to compulsion. And in fact, it appears, as I say, in relation to enrolment, voting very shortly in 1924, and preferential voting.
And in fact, I think the 1924 Act that made voting compulsory had like a 2.5-hour debate, and no ministers spoke and no one voted.
In fact, it was a private members' bill.
Yeah.
Okay, well, I think we'll wrap up proceedings at this point. I'd like to thank our panel members for their presentations and for giving the Commonwealth Electoral Act encouragement on its centenary. And I'd like to thank you all for joining us today.
Thank you. Thank you. Oh, that's good. That's good fun.
Interesting.